classes.
Okay, why don't we get started? It's a real pleasure today to welcome our speaker, Professor Susan Handy, for a lot of reasons. One reason is because Susan was for years a colleague of ours and taught in the UT Community Regional Planning Program from 93 to 2002. And then she left and went to UC Davis. And when Susan was here, and certainly as her career moved on at UC Davis, she's been a real leader and kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of very crucial transportation issues. And early on, she was looking at the relationship between urban and neighborhood form and transportation choices. She kind of continued that work and has done a lot of really important cutting edge work on non-motorized transit, facilitating non-motorized transit, and really looked and taken this work again, kind of a little bit ahead of the field's, time trajectory. Look at the relationship between these form, transit choices, and physical activity relationships. And the thing that I really have always appreciated about Susan's work is that she always asks us to have to put a critical eye toward these kind of overly decisive and overly general associations that we think we see between land use, form, transportation, and so on. So she's always asking us to put a critical eye toward that. And I think today she's going to ask us to put a critical eye toward the transportation planning enterprise in general.
That's right.
So Susan, welcome.
Great, thank you. Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here. As Michael said, I arrived here in 1993 from Berkeley. Spent 9 really interesting and rewarding years in Austin and on the faculty here at CRP, and then left for UC Davis in 2002. We have a tower too. But that, I cannot deny it, is a long arc. A lot of time has passed. My little Texans who were born here are now off in college. Austin has changed a lot since 1993, and the students that I had in my classes here are now leading things all over the place, all over the country. So I thought maybe I would use this opportunity to do some reflection and think about not just where I've come from and gone to, but think about what's happened in the field. Through all this time, are we now talking about and doing things differently and better than we were back in 1993? So I hope you'll indulge me in this a little bit, and hopefully we'll have some fun thinking about this. So I start out thinking, I'm just going to turn this way a little bit, that maybe roundabouts would be a nice metaphor for this talk. And I had this idea that I would talk about different ideas in transportation planning and kind of how they've smoothly flown through the roundabout or around the roundabout and moved us farther down the road, if you will. But the more I thought about it, I realized that this is probably a better metaphor for what's gone on in the field, that we, different ways to look at this, that we've been stuck in traffic and haven't made it around the roundabout, or if we're in the roundabout, we keep going around the roundabout and we never quite move forward the way we're hoping to, spinning our wheels, going around it in circles. And I think there's some examples of that around here that I've observed in the last 2 days. Austin, I almost said Davis, Austin, still trying to figure out what to do about rail, for example. That has not progressed a whole lot since I left. The drag looks pretty much as awful now as it did back then, despite you know, all that effort that went into thinking about a beautiful redesign of that street. So anyway, Austin's changed a lot, but there are things that haven't changed as well. So an example of kind of this stuckness, back in 1999, I had a CRP student take a look at a year's worth of New York Times articles and pull out things about transportation, just to kind of gauge, you know, the millennial, just gauge, you know, where we were. And you look at this list of topics, and 20 years later, you know, these are all things we're still talking about on and off. But the real punchline here is that actually these articles were pulled in 1999, but they were from 1899. And so a lot of the issues we were talking about 120 years ago were the same sort of issues we were talking about 100 years later, and that we're still talking about 20 years after that. So, you know, the problems haven't budged a whole lot. We have a lot of the same problems we used to have. And I think that has a lot to do with our approach to transportation planning not budging a whole lot. And as I started to think about it, it occurred to me that we've got these, we've got a whole bunch of beliefs that underlie how we do transportation planning, our approach to transportation planning. And that's what I want to look at today. So some of the beliefs. Fast is good. Congestion is bad. Highway expansion reduces congestion. I'll spend some time on that one. Expanding both highways and transit together makes sense. Congestion is in fact solvable, and mobility is the right goal. So what I want to do is spend a little time on each of these beliefs and a little bit about kind of where we have evidence that these beliefs are dominating what's going on, a little bit of history on some of these. And then the more positive part of my talk is going to be to think about how we're seeing some cracks in this system of beliefs and some new ideas starting to flourish, which I think are really important to helping us make some progress on the transportation front. So let's start with fast is good. And this is a belief not necessarily among planners, but certainly among people as a whole. We seem to have this human interest in speed. You know, partly it's a practical thing. We have a certain amount of time in our day. So if you need to get from one place to another, wouldn't it be nice if you can get there as quickly as possible so you can save some time for other sorts of things? So transportation planners talk about a travel time budget, and there's a lot of research on this, and it's a little bit controversial. But the truth is we have limited time in our day that we can spend traveling. So that's one reason why we think fast is good. But we do have this kind of innate human love of speed, maybe not all of us, but a lot of us, that goes way back, and interesting historic work kind of looking at this idea and how the car really changed things because it increased speed so much and let us really take advantage or satisfy that desire for speed that we have. So I haven't yet read this book, but I'm looking forward to reading that. And then, of course, we design roads for speed, right? So highway engineering has been all about making roads straighter, smoother, wider, all in the interest of increasing speed and sometimes safety, although that's questionable. I was known to make statements like this, reflecting on my time in Texas when I went back to California. It really does feel like maybe not just Texans, but people feel like they have a right to go where they need to go whenever they want to go, as fast as they can get there. So we like fast, but there are consequences, right? So speed versus safety is a really big concern in transportation. We know that the faster people are driving, the more injuries and fatalities there will be, whether you're in the vehicle or whether you're outside the vehicle. Lots of research on that. And as a consequence, cities are now rethinking the speed issue, and quite a few cities in the US have followed cities in Europe in terms of reducing speed limits. New York City, Portland, I think Seattle is among them. I don't know if there's any talk in Austin about dropping speed limits, at least in residential areas, but in the interest of safety. So a conscious decision that we will forego some of that speed in the interest of improving the safety of our environments. And if you're really interested, there's a hashtag for you. Okay, and then, slow food. We've got the slow food movement. Maybe we should have a slow movement as well. That just came to me. So, for example, I do a lot of research on bicycling these days, and one thing I was working on over the last year was digging into some interviews we'd done some time ago about what is it that people really like about bicycling. And sometimes it's the speed, like when you talk about what people liked as kids when they were bicycling, it was speeding down the hill and crashing. People seem to actually like the crashing. At least when they look back on it as an adult. But, as an adult, another thing they like about it is the slowness. You slow down and take a look at the environment and appreciate the world around you. So, speed is not, is not the be all and end all, and sometimes slow is something that we want in our lives. Okay, congestion is bad. Everybody agree? No. Alex, contrary. Right. So, no one likes congestion, right? You don't like being stuck in traffic. It's frustrating, all of that. We have lots of research about the costs of congestion, economic costs of congestion. We can argue about that, but certainly the personal, physical health impacts of congestion. It stresses us out. That's not good for us. Impacts on worker productivity, and so on and so forth. So, there are reasons to believe that congestion is bad. And then we bake that into how we evaluate the transportation system with this thing called level of service. So, have you learned about level of service? I see some nods. Okay, so this is our dominant performance measure for the transportation system, and it's all about delay. How much delay do drivers experience in the system, whether you're talking about intersections or highways, and it's all about your delay relative to what? Free flow speed. So how much delay do you experience relative to how quickly you'd be able to travel if there were no congestion, right? So we're setting that as the standard, this free flow speed. But is congestion all bad? Not necessarily. Where do we have congestion? Urban areas. Austin. I was shocked at the traffic midday coming from the airport into downtown. Why does Austin have such bad traffic? Yeah, well, lots of people, but lots of activity, right? Austin has a lot of traffic because there's lots of good stuff going on here, that the economy is thriving. And in fact, you can think of congestion as an indicator of a strong economy. Where we've seen congestion go down in recent decades, it was during the recession when fewer people were working, and that's when you see congestion go down. So that's another way to look at congestion, that it's an indicator of a strong economy and lots of good things happening. So maybe we shouldn't worry about it quite so much. And in fact, in California, we are officially shifting away from, well, at least starting officially to shift away from a focus on congestion as a part of we have the California Environmental Quality Act, which requires lots of environmental impact assessment of not just transportation projects, but land development projects. And that has always been focused, the transportation portion of that has always been focused on level of service. So you build a new big apartment complex, how much traffic is that going to generate? How much worse is level of service going to get? And in recent years, we've come to realize that, well, that's not really very much tied to the environment. That's all about congestion, but what about the environmental impacts? So the state is shifting from a focus on level of service when it assesses projects to a focus on vehicle miles of travel, or VMT is our new focus. I'll talk more about that later. And I will point you to, I'm very proud of this. My students just published a JAPA paper on this very topic. Okay, so maybe congestion not all bad, and maybe not what we should be focusing on. Okay, the next belief, expanding highways reduces congestion. How many of you believe that? I see some no's, some yeses. All right, we are still expanding highways, maybe not quite at the rate that we used to be, but billions are going into highway expansions every year. Really huge project a couple years ago in LA where years of living through the construction process, including a weekend where the whole thing had to be shut down before it could finally be opened. It opens up. Is traffic any less? Not so much. Texas, found this on the website, the Texas Clear Lanes initiative, I guess, with all these congestion projects and all these millions of dollars for all these different interchanges. Public benefit, reduced congestion. Okay, so we are justifying these highway investments with the idea that they are going to be reducing congestion. But what happens when we add capacity? New capacity, faster speeds, at least initially. Faster speeds, how do people respond? Well, faster speeds, shorter times. Time is money. So faster times means lower costs. What do people do when costs go down? Consume more, supply and demand, Econ 101. So shorter times, people are going to make farther trips than they otherwise would have. They're going to make more trips than they otherwise would have. They may make more trips by car rather than other modes than they otherwise would have. And you end up with more travel, more driving than you had before, which of course then creates this pressure for more capacity. You can explain it with supply and demand curves, and I'm not going to get into detail on this, but essentially what you're doing is shifting the supply curve, reducing the cost, so that you end up with what's called induced travel. And in this case, in particular, induced driving, that the added capacity leads to more driving. And then there are long-term effects too, where you add the new capacity, faster speeds, better access to undeveloped lands, which then leads to new development in those areas, maybe not in total, but in those areas, which tends to be lower density, more sprawling development. You may bring more people to the community, you're going to end up with more driving, and again, you get this pressure for more capacity. And again, you can explain this with supply and demand curves. In this case, we're talking about a shift in the demand curve over time, which eventually adds to even more driving than we had before. So you add that all up, and what you end up with is that the system is carrying more traffic. You've got more vehicle miles of travel. You're accommodating more driving, but your congestion doesn't go down. So a few years ago, we reviewed the evidence on this, and there's quite a bit of research out there. It is a tricky thing to study, and people have done it in different ways. But pretty much the studies all say the same thing, which is that within some not terribly long period of time, the amount of driving has grown enough that you've pretty much offset whatever benefit you initially had from the expanded capacity. So it's usually talked about in terms of elasticities. If you have a 10% expansion of that roadway, you're going to, in the end up with a 6 to 10% increase in vehicle miles of traveled on that roadway. So you're accommodating more driving, but you're not reducing congestion, at least in the long run. So this is not research I've done myself. We just reviewed it and synthesized it, and we put out this policy brief. But it turns out this is a really hot topic, and this is probably what I get contacted about more than anything from the media and from various advocacy groups. So yeah, just some examples of the emails I get. There have been several groups in California that have contacted me about proposed highway expansions and, you know, tell me about this induced demand thing, induced travel thing. Santa Cruz, I went down there and did a talk for them. But out of state too, Arkansas, where's that one? Jackson Hole, Wyoming, they were having this issue too, all over the place. And Texas as well. So Houston Chronicle, and you know, people there concerned about this proposal to widen, I guess it's I-45 in Houston. And you know, just noting that here, look, we've been expanding the freeway over time, and our travel time's getting any better? No, it's just not helping. And there was just one a couple months ago, the same proposal, I guess, talking about, okay, not only is it not going to reduce congestion, but look what you're doing to the community to add that capacity. So you would think if it's a situation where you're going to be not only spending billions of dollars, but taking out housing and moving people, that we'd want to be pretty sure that we were going to get some real benefits out of the project. And not just to pick on Texas, but you know, same issues in California. So that I-405 project in LA, you know, afterwards people said, you know, we haven't really noticed any improvement in the traffic. It takes just as long to get everywhere. But of course, the counter argument is, well, it would have been a whole lot worse if we had not done anything. But we don't actually know that, because if they hadn't done anything, people would have adjusted their behavior in various ways that might have kept things pretty much the way it was. So anyway, lots of belief that highway expansion is going to reduce congestion, even though we've known this for a long time. So there's this wonderful article, I think by a historian, that looked back and found people talking about this idea back in the 1920s when we were first building highways in a very big way, and found that the argument about induced travel was suppressed because this consensus had emerged about the need for highway building. Okay, so we've known this for a long time. We just can't seem to quite accept it officially. Oh, and then I love this quote. So some people in Texas get it. Well, and that picture is just unbelievable. But here's the mayor of Houston. I don't know if is he still the mayor? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, he got it. He's like, you know, why do we keep doing this? Things aren't getting better, but we keep expanding the freeway. And before you know it, all you have is freeway. And where's the city in this picture? So we've been, like I said, we've been kind of engaged in this because of our review of the literature. But another thing we've done is put together a little very simple spreadsheet calculator using the elasticities that come out of the research. So that if people want to try and estimate how much additional driving is there going to be because of this expansion, they've got this tool that lets them do it. And again, official California policy is moving on this issue in that now when transportation projects go through the environmental review process, they have to be evaluated with respect to their impact on induced travel, which is something that DOTs have not been doing, or at least not adequately been doing. So we're making a little headway on this topic and making sure that we're accounting for this when we're evaluating potential investments. Okay, adding highway and transit capacity at the same time makes sense. Okay, so people have not given up on the idea that we should maybe not be investing so much in widening our highways. The field, I would say, has come around on the importance of investing in other modes, transit in particular. But what I'm seeing is more of everything approach. So when people talk about congestion, they'll still talk about highway expansion, but they'll talk about other stuff as well. So this comes out of, I'm going to pick on TTI here, the Texas Transportation Institute. Nobody here from TTI, I hope? Oh, okay. Well, so they put out this, annual urban mobility report that everybody latches onto. Here's how bad congestion is. It's so much worse than before. All the dollar costs that adds up to. So they talk about the solutions, and the idea is more of everything. We need more road building and all of this other stuff. Well, when I think about that, that just seems crazy to me. And here's a California example that just drives me crazy, is Highway 101 between Marin and Sonoma counties, which is lovely wine country north of San Francisco. There's this very narrow little area where the state has decided they need to be widening the freeway because there's a lot of commuting from Sonoma down to Marin and San Francisco. But they just opened a new rail service from Santa Rosa down to Marin, almost to the ferry. We're almost getting to the ferry that would take you to San Francisco. So does this make sense? Why would we, after we've invested millions in doing this, why do we then expand the freeway to make it easier to drive, which reduces the incentive to get on the train, right? Really, we should be going all in on the train, and having congestion on 101 is a good incentive for people to get on the train. Of course, maybe it's not so bad because they're going to widen that and congestion is not going to get better for reasons I just explained. So maybe it's fine. I don't know. Anyway, I'd prefer to see the money going into the smart train. Congestion is solvable. Okay, all of this, let's widen the freeways, let's add transit. That's going to reduce congestion. You've got to believe that congestion is solvable. Is congestion solvable? Well, let's think about that. Cities have always been congested. Okay, you look back 100 years, well, modern cities, 100 years, 150 years, we had congestion then. It's not like they were free-flowing. Really nice work by Asha Agrawal-Weinstein, who's on the faculty in the planning program at San Jose State, where she was focused on Boston in particular, about the discourse over congestion back at the turn of that century through the 1920s. We've always had congestion. People have always been complaining about congestion. So all of this effort, all of these decades, and we maybe have not made a whole lot of progress. So I think congestion is solvable, but you've got to think about it as solvable, not meaning reducible. We're not necessarily going to reduce congestion, but there are ways to solve it. So I think about providing alternatives. That's a way to solve it, is if you don't need to get in your car and sit on the freeway, it's solved for you. You've got an alternative. You can go around that congestion. So focusing on these other modes is really important. And then, of course, we do know there is one way we really could reduce congestion if we had the political will, and that's to do congestion pricing, which has been done in other parts of the world. New York City now, I think, on the brink of doing it, and other cities contemplating it. There's talk about this in the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, as a way to manage congestion. And the nice thing is it raises lots of revenues too, which you can then pour back into those other modes. So it's a way to discourage driving, at the same time help to make the alternatives better. There are equity issues. Alex might want to talk about those, but there are ways to get around that, given that you've got some nice revenues coming in, different ways you can handle the equity issues and still appropriately price the roadway system. And then all of this sort of boils down to this question of mobility versus accessibility. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So I would say that all of these beliefs I've been talking about so far really kind of boil down into this idea that mobility is the right goal. And what I mean by mobility is essentially the ability to move. Okay, and again, we see the urban mobility report, a lot of focus on that. When we talk about the transportation system, it's a lot about how hard it is for people to move, or how can we make it easier for people to move. So a lot of focus on movement, okay, and movement is important, so that makes sense. Just a little more about how I think about this. Good mobility, when you see it, it's an ability to move around easily. Poor mobility, and inability to move around so easily. The counter idea and the counter belief has also been around for a long time. It just hasn't made its way so officially into our transportation policy and planning, and that's the idea of accessibility. And Lewis Mumford did some really great writing about this in the 50s. And it just makes sense, right? That the transportation system is not an end in itself. Movement isn't movement for its own sake, except when it is, and there are sometimes when it is. But for the most part, we're moving to get somewhere. So the transportation system is a means to the end being getting to a place where you can participate in the activity that you want to participate in, whether it's work, coming to a lecture, shopping, whatever it is that you need to be doing. So, so this is an idea that at least the academic planning community really likes and has been talking about for a long time, and feels right to us, that accessibility really is the goal that we should be focused on. Again, a little more about what I mean by that. So good accessibility would be an ability to get what you need, and different things go into that, including being close to destinations, having good connections to destinations, having choices about those destinations and about the ways to get to those places. And then, of course, poor accessibility is the inability to get to the places that you need, with few destinations or no destinations of the type that you need, and poor connections, and so on and so forth. Okay, so Mumford wrote about this stuff in the 50s. When I started my dissertation work a long time ago, I found a lot of writing about this in the 70s. There seemed to be a real flurry of interest in this topic in the academic community. And here's one quote from, I think, a different paper that says, "Scarcely a book or paper on urban regional affairs does not allude to this idea of accessibility." So it's a really compelling idea, and lots of people were persuaded. This was a concept that was really important in my dissertation work as a way to understand this link between neighborhood design and travel behavior. Michael mentioned that. That's the kind of work I was doing when I first got here. So that's in the title of my dissertation, really important. When you go interview for academic jobs, you do what's called a job talk. And this was the final transparency of my job talk. Talking about what I was going to do once I got here. And I talked about accessibility as a performance measure for metropolitan regions was something I wanted to work on, because this made so much sense to me. And then shortly thereafter, I think about a year after I'd been here, I published this essay in Access Magazine, which is a wonderful resource for all kinds of good ideas about transportation, about, again, that we should be focused on accessibility, not mobility. And I used my move from Berkeley to Austin as a way to explain this, because in Berkeley I had poor mobility but great accessibility, and here at that time, maybe not so much anymore, I had great mobility but I couldn't get the things I wanted, like a latte. Believe it or not, yeah, 1993, you couldn't get a latte in Austin, or a burrito, but that has all changed. Okay, so, but this I think is my writing that has been read the most. Of all the work I've done over my increasingly long career, I think this is the one that was the most out there. And I got a lot of response from people in transportation planning saying, yes, this is exactly what I've been trying to say. This is exactly what we need to be doing. So a lot of interest in the idea. But does that mean we changed how we were doing transportation planning? Well, here we are in the 2010s, and we're still working on it. So nice work by Brookings. They've got this Moving to Access project, which is all about the idea that we've been focusing on the wrong thing. We need to be focusing on accessibility. And in this decade, we're still saying this is what decision makers need to be focused on. So clearly, we haven't made a whole lot of progress on this one. So why is it so hard? This is interesting to think about. I think some of it is you say accessibility and it means different things. And especially in transportation, there's the whole ADA version of access and accessibility. So you got to sort of clarify that when you're first bringing up this idea. You see this all the time. People say accessibility and mobility, and they use them seemingly interchangeably, or at least in the same sentence without distinguishing them or clarifying what they mean. And you see this in all kinds of official documents. Maybe not quite so much anymore, but for a while that was really common. So people got the accessibility idea, but they hadn't quite figured out what that meant. We've got these standardized measures of mobility. Level of service is a mobility measure. So we've got the highway capacity manual, which tells us how to do it, and it's what everybody does, and it's well accepted. So that's what we do. We focus on that. And if that's what we're measuring, then implicitly, even if we talk about accessibility, we're still doing mobility. Our decisions are still based on this measure of level of service. And yeah, we could talk about this some more. I mean, the point is that we're now talking about new goals, but we need new performance measures to go along with that. We can't just keep using our old performance measures and think that we're actually making progress on these other kinds of goals. So that brings us to the need for new performance measures. And I will call out Alex Karner's project with the NCHRP program, which is doing this, is looking at all the different ways we could go about measuring accessibility, what is current practice, and what are some of the options for agencies to do this. And I think what's really exciting about this is that, that the project is funded by state departments of transportation. So you expect cities to sort of get these ideas, but state DOTs have been, that's the real challenge when we're talking about this mobility versus accessibility thing. So for me, this is signs of real progress, and I'm really looking forward to the end result of the project because I think it'll really help agencies out there start to do this. But part of the challenge is just that accessibility measures are inherently more complex, I think, than this level of service measure that we've been using, although there's complexity there too. And there was a great effort in Europe that looked at this very question, where they had a bunch of researchers there who were developing these accessibility tools and then tried them out with practicing planners to see, does this work? Will they use these? How does it change things? And they just found a lot of, it was a big challenge to get people to really understand this concept in a practical way, to understand, okay, accessibility, great idea, but how does this then change things in practice? So we're making some progress, but we need to really get there. And this is my belief, and I think increasingly other people's belief, that this is really important, this idea of shifting from a mobility perspective to an accessibility perspective. So I just want to give you some of my argument for why this is so important. So planning for mobility is what we've been doing. We've been focusing on level of service. It's all about giving priority to vehicles. We've been making it easier to drive. What happens when we make it easier to drive? By building more roads, for example. Make it easier to drive. The amount of driving goes up, like we talked about. Levels of congestion go up. Congestion going up reduces mobility, right? When congestion goes up, it's harder to move. And then you've got pressure for adding more roadway capacity yet again. And what do we call this? Vicious cycle. All right, so that's why it doesn't work, right? Because we build and you make it easier to drive, and then you just keep building more. And we never get ahead. And part of it is because our mobility in the US is so car focused. So we've been focused on providing mobility through connectivity by improving the connections to places. We could, if we're thinking in an accessibility way, we could focus more on proximity, putting people closer to destinations so you don't have to move so much. But no, we've been all focused on, making it easier for people to move and not worrying about where they need to be going. So our accessibility has been very mobility dependent. To get to where we need to be, we need to be able to move. And not only that, but our mobility has been very car dependent. We focused on making it easy to move by car and spent much less effort focused on making it easy to move by other modes. Well, some of that's getting better. And so then what that means is that when traffic increases, our mobility declines and our accessibility declines. So, in that sense, given the system we've built, congestion is bad because it is affecting our accessibility. But that doesn't mean trying to reduce congestion is the right way to solve it. So, whoops, went backwards. Okay, and then, so given all of this, right, this car dependent, that our accessibility is so dependent on car mobility, then that leads to this argument that, okay, well then, we need to reduce congestion so that accessibility is better. And that is, accessibility should be better, but it doesn't mean that reducing congestion is the only way to do that. Because if we focus on congestion, we just will fall into this vicious cycle trap, if that makes sense. So instead, the alternative is to plan for accessibility, which means focusing on other things like livability and can people get what they need? Do they have jobs? You give priority to people rather than cars. And I like to think of it as making it easier to not drive rather than making it easier to drive. If we do that, then the need for driving goes down, which means the need for roads goes down, which saves us lots of money and reduces environmental impacts. Will it reduce the amount of driving? Not necessarily, because that depends on what we choose to do. So I can't say for sure that an accessibility approach means we will get less driving. We may have to do other things like congestion pricing or road pricing in general. And so it doesn't mean we're going to necessarily reduce congestion, but congestion becomes less relevant because you have alternatives, right? And you don't need to drive so far. So for me, this is where we need to be heading, my belief. That's a happy cycle. All right, so another way to think about it, stop worrying so much about cars and congestion, worry more about people and places. Another way to think about it, what we really need is a paradigm shift. The old way, we've been focusing on making it easier to drive. In the new way, we need to be focused on making it easier to not have to drive, giving people choices. So I will add one more belief in here before I wrap up, because it seems like this also needs mentioning. Technology. What about all this interesting stuff going on with respect to technology today? Isn't this going to solve our problems? Maybe we don't have to do all this hard accessibility stuff, get people to change their behavior, build more livable communities, and all of that. Well, anybody believe that technology is going to solve all our problems? Yeah, no. I'm not so sure about it. So, self-driving cars. Well, yeah. So, and for one thing, we've been, talking about this for decades. It's not so clear we're going to actually have them anytime soon. There's certainly some benefits, the kind of work that Sandy does, but lots of issues that cities are now trying to think about and anticipate. I'm not such a fan of this. I'm also a skeptic. Whoops, wrong way. But other things going on out there. Scooters, you guys have a lot of those around here. I've seen them all over the place. I personally am a scooter skeptic. I think bikes are perfectly fine. I don't know why people have to have scooters. But women seem to like them more than bikes. There's less of a gender gap, and that's kind of interesting. But, you know, these are not such a new idea either. Yeah, so maybe, you know, maybe the time has come and now they're cheap. So now they'll be a thing. Anyway, I personally think the old technologies are probably you know, the answer. The new versions of the older technologies, you know, the stuff we had 100, 120 years ago works pretty well if you just invest in them and support them. So this is an idea I came across surprisingly late in my arc of a career, but I really like this idea that technology is a social construct. You know, it's not a given what any particular technology will do for us. It's up to us to decide how we want to use that technology. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as we look at all the new things that are happening these days. And we're doing a lot of thinking at UC Davis about some of these new technologies, and in particular about the policy that we need to put in place to make sure that those technologies evolve in a way that will be beneficial to society and not simply create more problems. But that's a challenging thing to think about. But I will point out that there's going driverless, and there's going driverless. So we have some options, right? And then just finally to wrap up, very unscientific, kind of looking back on what we've just talked about, the beliefs that I think have dominated transportation planning, I would posit that. And then the beliefs that the more profitable beliefs, in my opinion, where we need to be headed. And then some thinking about, well, you know, what sort of progress are we making towards shifting to these new kinds of beliefs? And I think there is a lot of shifting going on right now. It's a very interesting time in the field. And yeah, like I said, totally unscientific. But I think, you know, one thing that's interesting is this accessibility idea is really popular. People talk about that a lot. We have the issue that we don't have the measures we need to implement that in a practical way. But I also worry that if we don't lose some of those other beliefs, like fast is good, congestion is bad, if we don't start thinking about those things in a very different way, we're never going to get very far. And that's, I don't know, that's a little scary because some of that is really fundamental, right? I mean, I think we really, really have to start thinking in a very different way to really solve our transportation problems. So I'm done. Thank you. Love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. Bob Patterson, hello. Yeah.
I really like to talk.
Thank you.
And so I guess here in Austin, we're grappling with everything we just talked about. And we were talking in class about what to do about it. And I preach what you say. I thought that the answer is accessibility. And we're talking, kind of curious if you kind of reflect on the issue of kind of the immediacy sensitive problem in the practical character of grayfield versus greenfield and changing to an accessibility format. I like to think that Austin's like a Queen Mary. And to do an accessibility solution, what's happening in Austin, it's like trying to make for what people want. It's like turning the Queen Mary on a dime.
Turning what?
It's turning the Queen Mary on a
Oh,
dime.
yeah, yeah.
You have all this built-in accessibility.
Yeah, yes, yes.
Really talking about is the benefit of urban transformation.
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
That's a slow process.
It is a slow process. And there's a lot of pain in the meantime, right? Because we don't have our solution to congestion until we have gotten pretty far down the road towards a more proximity accessibility-oriented community. I'm an academic. I don't have the answers. Yeah, no. I mean, I think Austin, I mean, certainly development-wise, you know, accessibility is going to mean higher densities. Not that everybody has to live at high densities, but you need some critical mass of people to be able to have things within closer proximity. So it seems like there's a lot of stuff happening centrally, but I haven't been out to the edges. I assume it's still sprawling out that way. So getting some control over that becomes important. I did just publish a book chapter talking about accessibility. It's in an urban design handbook, so it's kind of focused on design aspects. But I use Davis as an example. I mean, it's a small city, so it's not applicable to everywhere. But what it's done right is it's a lot about the edge. You know, Bob, your growth management stuff you talk about, right, is that it has kept a firm boundary. It's very hard to develop outside of that boundary, and you know that forces things up to some degree. It also tends to tamp down development, which has been a problem because then housing prices rise. So we need to allow more, you know, inward, upward development than we have. And then it's supported with, you know, good land use planning in terms of putting retail in every neighborhood, having the bike network that makes it easy for people to get around. We have a decent little bus service in town. So I think it's a nice example of accessibility planning on a small scale. There's an idea from Europe that I really like. Oh, am I going to get this right? The German is Stadt de kurzen Wegen. Anybody speak German? City of short distances. And it's that idea is let's focus on the proximity part of the accessibility equation and less on the contribution of mobility to accessibility. Let's get proximity. Yeah, but obviously easier if we do it right from the start, and if you're talking about fixing everything we've done for decades, it's a real challenge. Alex?
So just jumping off what you
Yeah.
just said.
Yeah.
I think one issue with the accessibility measures that are used in practice,
Uh-huh.
you know, like a common one is cumulative opportunities, right? How many things can you reach in a given amount of time? If you just focus on congestion, you alluded to this, if you just improve mobility, then accessibility increases. So it's not the case that if you have accessibility taken up in practice that we're actually going to get the types of outcomes that you want.
Right.
It seems like the underlying issue is this idea of proximity or land use.
Yes.
It's really hard to make work in the
Yes.
context. We have one example from California, SB 375, right, which was supposed to more tightly regulate housing, transportation, and land use. That didn't really work, right? But that was the goal. Everyone,
Yeah,
when I was at
yeah.
David, that was when I started at David.
Yeah, so it was a state policy that was trying to force the regions and local governments to do the right thing. Yeah.
So that didn't really work, right? The most
Right.
recent evidence shows that driving has in fact increased.
Yeah.
So what do we do, right? What are some best practices for getting transportation planning agencies to really think about land use? I think that's the power of the accessibility approach is realizing that you can improve conditions for people by bringing things closer together. By
Yeah.
integrating
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, I think, or billions of dollars question. Jean-Claudia might have the answer. Yeah, no, and when we've got the powers so separated, people doing transportation over here, people thinking about land use over there, and so much of the land use power is at the local level, maybe a little less true in California. Maybe not. And then, you know, each community is focused on its own self-interest. And quite often that means not approving higher density housing and certainly not approving affordable housing. Yeah, so that's what California is working on now, at least some of our legislators, is to force local governments to allow the kind of development we need. And I think this movement away from single family zoning, is that something that's been talked about here? Yeah, so that's kind of a step in that direction. I mean, that's a lot about the housing problem, but it's also about the transportation problem. Yeah.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Uh-huh.
It's like a reading an article. always new thoughts, new insights,
Yeah.
old concepts. And
I'm spinning circles. It's like,
no, but I was just
same stuff I've been talking about.
in terms of this accessibility, mobility discussion, now look at the newer generations and the new ways of consuming. Lots of people increasingly, exact proportionally, I guess, someone, and doing this online consumption, shopping, eating. So this access to destination opportunities, and not necessarily they go.
Right,
but
right.
And they consume online, and then the suppliers that deliver.
Yes.
So suppliers compete for speed, for on-time
Yes, they
delivery,
do.
and fast delivery. So how
Yeah.
can that fit into this discussion in the future, maybe next phase of next generation systems for mobility and accessibility?
Yeah, yeah, excellent point. So, right, that, fast is good. It's not just us moving, but things moving to us. How many of you have done same-day delivery? Will you admit it? That's a problem. Right. So if we, we need to get over that. We've got to have things fast mentality, I think. Or we as a society decide that we can't afford that because it's adding to congestion. We know that. It's creating environmental impacts. We know that. We could say that's just not allowed, that you can't have it that fast. We could do that, right? I mean, that's up to us. But yeah, if we just let the market do what it's going to do, I think fast is going to win, and we benefit when I get the thing right away, but we suffer in other ways. I don't know if other people have thoughts about this. Yeah, back there.
Yeah, I'd actually argue that the accessibility of those things we want has become so visible or just not
Uh-huh.
that we've reached out to these solutions to get those things because we can't get them in the way that we would want to otherwise.
Yeah, the traffic's so bad, I'm not going to bother going to the store. I'll just have it brought to me. Yeah, right. And then it's actually just making traffic worse, so it's another vicious cycle. Yeah.
Make the accessibility there. Part of that. I mean, I don't think the demand will go away entirely. People
Yeah.
will sit on the couch. But the folks who actually want to walk somewhere to get their coffee or to get their food or to ride their bike to get groceries will.
Yeah, there are a couple other hands over here.
Such a wonderful talk. Would it be really impudent for me to suggest an additional possible mistaken belief?
No, I think there are lots of others we could talk about.
And I think this is kind of implicit in a lot of what you were saying, but I think there's just an assumption, whether it's stated or not, that a certain amount of death and maiming is an acceptable product of our transportation system.
It's certainly an implicit belief. Yeah, good point. You've had your hand up some. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about, so like, we recently in like a class with Charlotte learned that a lot of trips on I-35 are local trips actually, with people finding distances. And if you improved accessibility in the city, you would hopefully see those trips disappear, but wouldn't that just sort of increase indirectly the capacity of our freeways and sort of not remove the problem? It seems like solutions that let the freeway remain, and then you aren't reducing the ability for sprawl to happen or something.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's true. I totally glossed over that, if you get people driving less, there could be an induced driving effect of that, right? Because they're freeing up capacity. So, yeah, it's hard to follow all of that out. So, what I argue is that you've got to provide the alternatives and price driving appropriately, which, will we ever do that? I don't know. Yeah.
You have to attack it at every level of the cycle to sort of.
Yes, right. And yeah, so we're trying to improve the alternatives now without doing anything to discourage driving, which is just crazy to me. Yes.
Susan, I really like the talk, especially in the last page when you list the short sentence, like principle, livable city. I also agree we need to change to more like a livable city accessibility measure, but in this process, we cannot do it alone. We need a friend, we need allies. So if you're thinking, why the highway was planned for cars, it's not just because the engineer trying to do it. This is because the car company, oil company, construction company, they do this all the day. They drive workshops and they have a large donation to make the policy work for them. And I think if we want to create a better, livable city, we also need allies. And the private transportation field, I think a direct ally will be very sad in this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we can say whatever we want to say. We're still going to build whatever we want to build because there's a market, there's profit in that.
Right. Yeah, all those car ads where there's no congestion, even on city streets. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the public health field is, they sort of joined in about 20 years ago, about the time I was leaving here. Yeah, it's been almost 20 years. And, the safety issues there, I think, that brings in another set of allies. But I don't know. Yeah, it's a really tough one to fight. And then I think along with that, this is my other point, the public doesn't necessarily understand what I've just gone through. You ask people, you go to a party and you say you're a transportation planner. What do? They complain about congestion and they say, why can't we just widen such and such? When are we getting those extra lanes on I-80? Yeah, so they don't get it, right? They still think adding to the highway system makes sense. And so then the politicians have to say that's what they're going to do. And the politicians all say this is going to reduce congestion because that's what the public wants to hear. So I think we're a big part of the problem too. But yeah, as you say, we're fighting this huge lobbying and advertising behemoth of the car lobby. All right, some other folks, yeah.
On the subject of deprioritizing speed and mobility,
yeah.
The only thing I worry about is that with the housing market being so expensive,
Oh, I know.
if you limit the geographical area in which, if you don't prioritize mobility, then people being less mobile have to be closer to work, which makes
And they can't afford it, yeah. Yes.
So I'm wondering.
I know.
I guess you also have to then work on like residential housing.
Definitely, yes. And I think that's where the discussion has shifted in California it's housing is our transportation problem, right? We've got to fix that. And then some of the transportation problem takes care of itself. But yes, absolutely. Huge equity issues around all of this. We've got to do it the right way. Yeah, right there.
Another belief that people also have is that you as a driver are not part of traffic. It's you. I think that's really important. People think about their, that you are traffic.
Right. Yeah, the problem isn't me. It's everybody else in their car on the freeway at the time I want to go. Yeah, I think it's a lot about us and us as people, not us as planners, but how we think about things. Really, we've got to be a little more broad-minded. I'll go there and then come to Sandy. Okay.
I think it's interesting that we also try to sell public transit projects as reducing congestion, but a lot of times they don't actually. So
No.
we kind of reframe those and sell those to the public without also telling them as reducing congestion.
Yeah, it's kind of a catch-22 in a way, because how do you get people to support it if they don't think it's going to help with congestion, because they're so focused on congestion problem. But you're right, that's totally misleading to say that. Yeah, I don't know. How do you get people to realize the value of having that alternative? Choice. Yeah, choices. Getting, get people to try it and see that it can be a good thing for them. I don't know. We need psychologists, I think, to help out. Sandy.
Well, as a transportation person, my entire career I've been blamed for all the urban problems. And I want to turn it around. I think it is housing.
Yeah.
It isn't transportation, it's housing and affordable housing. And if you go out to Pflugerville and Leander and all of these places that are growing like topsy, it's because you can get a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a little backyard for half or less of what you can get it for in Austin. And if people make those kinds of decisions, then they have no choice. They're not
Right,
going to take
right.
public transit that doesn't go, what, you're going to drive to 20 miles? Some people do to take, I mean, that's a stupid solution. I think we've got to get at the affordable housing issue so that people can live close to their jobs. Or if they don't live close to their jobs, they can still take public transit in a node to, a system that supports that. And if we don't deal with the land use problems, I mean, look at all, there's this whole thing about BART, that whole stations don't support the communities where the stations are. They're even built backwards so that you'd have to walk a half a mile around even if you live next to the station. Unless we deal with these land use and housing issues, I think this is just blowing in the wind. That we're going to keep building freeways because people keep moving 20 miles out because that's where they can find a house.
Yeah. I like that. Blame it on the housing people. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, we're not solving it. Yeah, well, we can't do it on our own, for sure.
And people beat us up all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hello.
So it's interesting here in Austin, politics comes into a lot of this, and a lot of this kind of, they're not going to steal these freeways out of my cold dead hands.
Yeah.
And literally, if you go and see the politics of that kind of urban, suburban, exurban, rural tension that exists all across, we can see it in our own MPO, and it's almost painful to watch the meetings. I don't know how many of you go to the MPO meetings, but it's actually painful to see the dynamic that exists across the aisles from the urban and suburban interests. And if you look at just, I'm in the industry, so frankly, we're about to spend $7 or $8 billion on I-35, and
it's not a congestion pricing project, I take it.
Well, so this is where the politics comes in.
Yeah.
Because the legislature said no toll roads.
Yeah.
And so we've got some congestion pricing on MOPAC, where the tolls get as high as $10, $11, and I think that when, the mention of equity issues, it's not as big a deal on the equity because you can promote transit. There's an effort to move some of that excess funding to build more transit and create more equity. But just overall, like if you look at the thoroughfare plan for Williamson County, it's all freeways, and they plan on building across a multitude of freeways, access control facilities throughout the county. I mean, probably a dozen of them. And so,
where does it stop? Yeah.
A lot of it's political, and a lot of it's interest, and it's hard to get away from the politics of that tension that exists between people who need your respond that this is, you're threatening my lifestyle. And so we've got to figure out how to deal with that.
Yeah. Yes, we do. Back there. Things don't fall apart. We don't have a lot of examples of freeway removals, but where it's happened, the system just adjusts. San Francisco took out 2 substantial pieces of freeway that were damaged in the 1989 earthquake. And they've been wanting to do it for a long time. And then the earthquake happened and they got the funding to rip them out. And it was fine. It works. Yeah, so the point is people adjust, right? People are constantly adjusting. You build a new freeway, people are going to adjust in a way that means more driving. If you take out capacity, people adjust in a way that makes the system work. Yeah. I don't think you've done that in Texas, take out a freeway yet. There's some little examples around. Yeah. Other? Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that, this discussion, at the end of the day, driving has to be made more costly. And I would argue you have to get the prices of driving right.
Yes.
And to get the price of driving right, you need to double or triple the cost of driving. And that,
Probably.
by getting the prices right, I'm sort of framing it in kind of economist terms.
Right.
You have to internalize the real externalities of auto-based transit. So if you had look at Europe, gas prices are 3 times as expensive.
Yeah.
We have these tremendous subsidies for implicit subsidies for auto transit. If we just put in like a big fat carbon tax, and add congestion pricing and toll roads on that, but just really get the price.
There's
right.
a solution.
And
Yeah.
People will switch. I mean, I'm enough of an economist
Yeah.
to believe that price
Yeah.
signals matter. They're not,
Yeah.
not matter as much as economists think, but they do matter. And you just have to escalate that cost. And it'll take a long time, but that's a kind of backstop that can push behaviors in the direction.
Absolutely. Ivory tower solution. We know it, but
other countries in the world have carbon taxes.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not completely ivory tax.
No, but
other places are fighting back against them too.
yeah.
Nobody likes them. Nobody likes
Yeah.
taxes.
Well, they stopped them in Holland and they stopped raising them in
Oh
Britain.
no, they have a huge carbon tax over here.
That's what worries me though, is like, it's one thing if in Europe or in New York they had decades of pro-car planning and then
Yes.
they finally saw the light and turned back and shifted back towards
Right.
transit and walking and biking. But if you're here and
Yeah.
there's no cultural memory of it at all, is it possible to do this phase shift? That's the thing that worries me.
Yeah, and it's a chicken and the egg thing because you can't just raise prices if you don't have alternatives in place.
Compensatory policies, equity policies, right? So you
And you have to have good transit and
housing
yeah.
program in the U.S. if you had a big carbon tax.
Yeah, but you need a lot of infrastructure investment too, other than road infrastructure investment in place by the time that pricing comes in, or you're just making people miserable. I think.
First,
I don't know.
and then go from there.
Spoken like a true economist. Bob.
And then having
Yeah.
come back to the US.
Uh-huh.
And so I lived in Bangor outside of Strasbourg for a time. And it's a village, which had a butcher
Yeah.
and a baker.
Yeah.
I could get everything I needed, so I was living in the perfect accessibility.
Yeah.
My kids walked to school every day.
And isn't it wonderful?
But the price of gas was insane. The price
Yeah.
of heat the house was insane. And so I was the crazy American who had all the lights on in their house the first week I was there. It's like my first bill. and then just like everybody in Europe, as you went from room to room, you turned off the lights sooner, and you turned off the heat in those places because the price of living is expensive.
Yeah.
And when I traveled, I trip changed carefully to be very, very sure that every trip I made got everything done along the trip that I needed
Uh-huh.
because the price of fuel was so high.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, I think the peak oil period, we all thought the price of gas, and there was a Hirsch report that came out from DOE that said the price of gas is going to double and it's going to triple and the U.S. economy is going to be destroyed. And one prediction of the Hirsch report was that VMTs would drop dramatically, exactly what Mike was talking about, due to the cost. So maybe in the long run, we just need people to come back. We just need to figure out how to get rid of hydraulic fracking.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's what basically took a lot of the pressure off. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Cheap fuel economy.
Right.
We live in a cheap fuel economy, and the end-use capital demand, I would argue, is probably substantially less.
Yeah.
But we have to price this. At the end of the day, maybe it's congestion pricing, but maybe it's also other ways to get price.
Yeah, well, California finally increased its gas tax a couple years ago. The state legislature passed that. And then there was a ballot proposition to roll it back, which failed. But we know it could work. It's just really hard.
How important do you think institutions are in this framework? Because a lot of what you've touched on suggests that local governments and land use policies are very important. A lot of the discussion here has talked about questions and potential solutions that require some level of higher governance leadership, whether that be state or really federal carbon taxes. coming from a perspective where you do have a fairly supportive, relatively speaking, in the United States, state level framework for pushing a more accessibility friendly agenda than perhaps other places. And yet there too, it's faltering.
Yeah.
At what level of government do we really need to see the most critical action, do you think?
Well, I think institutions are absolutely critical to this. And I think the problem is it's not one level. I mean, I think you need to have it happen at all levels, at least to some degree. I don't think, I mean, California at the state level has been trying to do it, but it has only so much ability to force lower level entities in the state to do things differently. Yeah, so if the cities aren't coming along with what the state's trying to do, it's not going to work, which is what's happened with SB 375. So, yeah, maybe that's why this is so hard, because you really do need that action at all levels and everybody on the same page as to what we're trying to achieve. And whether that's ever going to be possible, I don't know. Yeah. That's a downer note to end this on. Alex, do you have something positive for us? Okay, okay.
Yeah, so I've been following the work of the Three Revolutions Center at Davis, so like shared automated electric, and this goes back to your point about technology save us. It seems like a lot of those folks are concerned about like what types of TNC users are there. There's people that are kind of monomodal TNC users, or the people that are using TNC to trip chain, and there are these ideas that we can just, if you just get people to use TNCs to access transit and provide wouldn't that be great? But it seems like there are also, well, I think I see issues with ceding too much of our transportation system to the private sector, right? Because if
I
it becomes
agree.
too much, then we can withdraw from certain areas. We saw Lyft and Uber do in Austin.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the Three Revolutions future? What is it going to produce all the desirable outcomes that the folks at Davis and elsewhere think it will? And are there dangers of having the private sector be too integrated into our transportation system?
Yes, definitely. That latter point. Yeah, we talk about the heaven scenario and the hell scenario. I mean, again, I think there isn't one way it's going to go. It's hard to anticipate exactly which way it's going to go. And how it's going to go depends on what sort of policies we choose to put in place. So I don't think there's one answer. I'm not terribly involved in that effort, and I'm a lot more skeptical than some of my colleagues. I have one colleague in particular who's, he's just so high on the TNCs, and he's living this nice car-free life.
But he has a Tesla.
No, not right now. No cars. But he's living in Davis, downtown Davis, so he can walk to things and he bikes to work. But if he needs to go somewhere farther, he just hops in a Lyft and gets to where he needs to go, which is not cheap. I mean, yeah, so it's, I increasingly worry that the ability to not drive is a privilege, that it's available to those of us with plenty of resources to be able to live in a place where you have that option. And other people are forced to be out in the suburbs where they have no choice but to be driving. So that concerns me a lot. Like, how do we make it possible for everybody? But yeah, I'm, autonomous vehicles, I think they're going to be a nightmare, but I'm not sure they're going to happen. And are people going to share, if it is an autonomous vehicle, are people going to share their Uber and Lyft rides? Well, the rides are going to be so cheap that why bother sharing them? And then what's the other part? Oh, I am a huge believer in EVs. I love my Chevy Bolt. Although I probably drive it a little more than I would if I had a regular car, because I don't feel guilty when I'm driving it. It's so much fun. So yeah, I'm doing the bike thing. I'm still a big believer. Electric bikes too. Yeah.
Liz.
Liz.
So, thinking about the institutional thing, and
Yeah.
even in Texas, where
Ah.
Regional planning, what's that?
Yeah.
In Austin, we're talking about trying to densify and trying to
Yeah.
make things be closer to where we need to be, but we have no control over what happens outside of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And we have all this sprawling suburban development. And what occurs to me is how do we push suburban developers to do something different and demonstrate that there would be a demand for an alternative there. I think about when we developed the Mueller neighborhood, when it was first proposed and put forward, all the local development community was like, no one will ever want to live in a place with houses on such small lots. No one's going to want it. They were so skeptical. And then it was wildly successful, and now there's kind of copycat models that don't have as much public space and other things, but they kind of demonstrated that people did want that. And I was on the community advisory group for the last round of it, and I kept asking all the city folks that came to talk to us about what control we had over suburban development or subdivision regulations, and why didn't we make it a requirement in subdivisions that there had to be a node in the center of the subdivision with more density and mixed uses, and you make that possible through the bus hub, so you can get from there to somewhere, and but they don't really have that control outside of the city limits. They seem very reluctant to think about how they might get at that. But in a place like Texas, where it's so hard for us to get anything to be required, and where we don't have that control outside of cities, it seems like creating demonstration projects that help people see that there is a market, or that people would desire these other things, might be one way to begin.
Yeah, I think you just answered your question. I think that's what it takes. I think that's what it takes, right? You have some good examples where it worked and somebody made some money, and then somebody else is going to try and make some money the same way when we're so dependent on private development.
What public institution could help start?
Yeah.
Like we did it with the website because it was city owned, and we were able to
right.
But if you have a tract of land in the suburbs, how can you foster such a demonstration of something new?
Yeah. So in California, our counties have a lot more power than your counties. So you could have a county that, would say, we're not going to let development happen here, or if development's going to happen, we're going to make sure it's done a particular way, just like a city can. But even there, the counties just aren't so oriented that way. We have a lot of bad development going on in California too. Don't look at me for answers. This is all really hard.
I just want to follow up on that question. What do you think Google, Apple working with the California government developing affordable cars?
Oh, all this money Google and who else? Apple put up some money.
What do you think of this?
Well, I think it's better than them doing nothing. And hopefully that money gets used to make a difference in the housing market. We don't have a lot of public money going into housing these days. California did away with we had this whole redevelopment system, which was a really important source of funding for affordable housing. That Jerry Brown, God bless his soul, he was a good governor in a lot of ways, but he did away with redevelopment, and it's been really hard for cities since then. There were issues, I know, but so having some money is a starting point. But some of the choices they're making, like that Apple headquarters, that crazy round building, and it's nowhere near transit. Google's doing a little better. They're they're kind of on transit and helping support that kind of development. They run all those buses themselves. You must have that around here. The big buses? No? Oh. Which is kind of a whole company-run transit system.
5,000 jobs.
Yeah. So I think our problems are bad enough. Silicon Valley problems are bad enough that they are, they're chipping in and helping out a bit. But of course, they created all those problems, right? Yeah. So Michael's gone, but I think I'm supposed to end this at some point. You've been very patient to sit here.
We
Ming.
have time for a different topic. Question for you.
Okay, last one though.
Okay. Well, something particularly interesting. This talk about access, maybe talk about here, metro or local level. Well, really long distance access. What's the story? What's possibly the future of the high-speed rail?
Oh.
One of the most promising ones.
It's going up. There's some structure there. If you drive down Highway 99 between Fresno and Bakersfield, which I did in my electric vehicle a couple months ago. I don't recommend it unless you have a Tesla. But yeah, it's going up, and they haven't stopped it, so I assume.
That portion still alive.
Yeah, they're working on it. It's kind of quiet now. There was a little flurry when we got our new governor, and he's not quite as supportive as the previous governor, but it hasn't been stopped. It's going on. And Trump has not succeeded in taking his money back. He was going to rescind whatever federal money was going into it. I don't know. 20 years, maybe we'll have it. Yeah. Well, sooner than that, you'll be able to go from Fresno to Merced, but LA to San Francisco is a long ways away. Yeah. You can hardly wait.
Go from Fresno to Merced.
Oh, I know. Yeah, so that was not a happy note to end on, I don't think. But anyway, great questions. Thank you for all the discussion and the invitation.